Chapter of the Bhagavad-Gita, Lord Krishna affirms the Vedic philosophy or the darshana of one of the darshanas of the Vedic philosophy called Karma Mimamsa, which is the performance of fire sacrifice, of Vedic fire sacrifice, also known as Karma Kanda. And having affirmed this, in the fourth chapter, after establishing his authority to speak on the matter by announcing that he is none other than the Supreme Lord who has descended on this earth for the sake of establishing dharma, destroying the evildoers and providing salvation to these saintly persons. Krishna now has explained to us the philosophy that is unique to him, which is unique to the Bhagavad Gita. It is a performance of your work. It is a performance of your duties as a sacrifice, which is as important. And Krishna actually emphasizes and points out it is the most important of all yagyas, of all forms of sacrifice. More important than all the other sacrifices, including what has been described in the third chapter of the Bhagavad Gita or Karma Mimamsa. Now Krishna has explained that working in a spirit of devotion and renunciation without considering oneself to be the doer nor aspiring for the fruits of one's labor, that sacrifice that one performs is the sacrifice that takes you to salvation. यस्य सर्वे समारंभ काम संकल्प वर्जिता ज्ञान अग्नि दग्ध कर्माणि tam ahu panditam buddha. So Krishna explains that one who performs all actions as a sacrifice to please God, he is the true yogi, he is the true sannyasi. He in fact is the true pandit. Jnana agni dagdha karmani, and all his karmas have been burnt in the fire of knowledge. So at this stage, in the fourth chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna, having declared himself to be God and established his authority, and having reiterated and re-established for the first time in this chapter the importance of doing your work as a sacrifice to unite with God. Krishna now begins the description of other sacrifices to explain that just like there is karma mimamsa, there are many other sacrifices that are there in the Vedas. And not only are there many other sacrifices that are there in the Vedas, what I have just declared to you is my preferred form of sacrifice, which is the performance of work as worship. So Krishna explains that there are many forms of sacrifice. To remind you of what he has said in the third chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, in chapter 4, text 25, Krishna points out the fire sacrifice where Daivam eva pare yagnam, that there are people who offer sacrifices in the fire to worship the Devatas. And because that is a polytheistic form of worship, which is practiced by some, and Krishna is pointing out that there are others who perform the same sacrifice, not for the Devatas, but they perform it to the Supreme Brahman. Brahmagnao apariyagnam. So he is explaining that the sacrifice offered to many gods or the Devatas, and then sacrifice which is offered to the one God, which is the all pervading Brahman. Then Krishna describes the various sacrifices that are detailed in the Vedas. And these sacrifices include the sacrifices of the senses, by which one controls the mind. It includes the sacrifices of the mind through mindfulness, through breath. It also includes various other forms of sacrifice, which include the performance of giving of material possessions and also the performance of taking of strict vows and practice of eightfold mysticism, yoga yagna, which is the practice of meditation. He goes into further detail about the forms of sacrifice that deal with breath, which include stopping of the breath, the restraint of the breath, the observations of the breath, and eventually the ability to maintain what is known as exhalation and cessation of breathing as a form of yajna. Now, what is yajna? Yajna is that means by which we attain to yoga. Yoga is union with God, and yajna is that which helps us to realize our union with God. I'm repeating it because it's so important. Yajna is the means to attain yoga. Yoga means union with God. And yajna means that means by which we connect with God. So let us look at it from a little perspective of modern neuroscience and neuropsychology. Our sense of self, which is the source of all sorrow, because we so strongly identify with it, is the result of our brain working in a specific circuit, which is the default circuit of the brain. And this default circuit of the brain is that circuit which is active when you are not doing any work, which means that you have a task positive network when you are working, and when you are not working, you have a task negative network. Now, this task negative network is the default network because a lot of the time our minds are not engaged in doing work. And what happens in this default mode network or this task negative network? In this task negative network, what happens is that we are constantly thinking of ourselves and ourselves in relationship with other people. It is the means by which our monkey mind is activated. The default mode network is the monkey mind. And that monkey mind or the wandering mind is that mind which thinks of myself and my relationship with others within the world. So it is also called the social cognition network. And it is constantly thinking, what did I say? What did I do? What must I do next? How should I speak next time to the person who has insulted me before? How do I think of the person who was kind to me and nice to me? So it is always thinking of self, and it's constantly reconstructing this sense of self, this historical sense of self, this autobiographical sense of self, which is the cause of all your sorrow. Because whatever you are, you cannot remain. From youth to childhood to maturity to old age and finally to death, the sense of self must encounter considerable challenges every moment and every day. And this is the source of all suffering. It's not only called the source of suffering by philosophy which is related to the Vedas, even Shramana philosophies. For example, let's take Buddhism. Buddhism works on the principle that the sense of self which is created by your mind is an illusion and does not exist. It is called anatta, means there is nothing there. It is your imagination that you think that you are this person with this autobiography, with this history, with these relationships, with these accomplishments, with this guilt, all of this, which forms this bundle which is known as ahankara, the sense of self, is constantly being created, reconstructed, repaired, rebuilt, and expanded by your default mode network. What happens when you engage in yagna, in yagya? What happens when you engage in the performance of sacrifice? Engaging in performance of sacrifice means to move from task negative network and move on to a task positive network. It is to move from thoughts of self and move on to thoughts of divinity. It is to move from thinking of aham mam mameti, I, me, and myself, and moving from there to the Lord. Yagna is about remembering God and forgetting self. And it is by forgetting self and by remembering God that we attain to yoga, which is reunion with God. And this reunion with God brings about a spiritual depersonalization. It brings about a realization that this Prakriti is not you. It brings about a practical realization that all this mind, intelligence, ego, bhumi, apo, nalo, vayur, kham, mano, buddhi, revacha, Ahankara itya me bhinna prakriti ashtadha. That earth, water, fire, air, ether, mind, intelligence, ego, all these are not you. Indeed, you realize you are nothing material. It is a process by which you realize that you are truly neti, 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 neti. Not this, not this, not this, not this, not this. I'm not this body, I'm not this mind, I'm not this intelligence, I'm not this person who I think I am. अपरयामितस्त्वन्यं प्रकृतिं विधि मे परां जीवभूतां महाभावो ययेदां धार्यते jagat. For indeed you are divine, the spirit who is sustaining and maintaining creation. And because this spirit is nothing material, your realization is, of course, that I am nothing. I am not this person who you think I am. I am not this person who I thought I was. Indeed, I am truly nothing. This comes as a result of performing sacrifice. And the greatest contribution we got directly from God, Lord Krishna, is that if you perform your everyday duties, your everyday work, in a spirit of sacrifice with devotion to remember God and forget self, we will realize our divinity. Just as those who perform other forms of sacrifice will also realize their divinity. One form of sacrifice not mentioned here, but which comes later in the Bhagavad-Gita when Krishna is explaining, he says, I am this, I am that, I am the most wonderful of all the things that you have seen. At that time, he points out that of all forms of sacrifice, Yagna Nam, of all forms of sacrifice, Japo Yagnosmi, I am that sacrifice which is the chanting of the holy names. So Krishna gave you this contribution of a yagya, which whatever you are doing in this world as a duty, without any sense of desiring a fruit, performing it as an action of worship, whatever you do, yat karoshi yad ashnasi yat johosi dadasi yat tapasyasi kaunteya tat kurushva madarpanam. Whatever you do, whatever you eat, whatever you offer, whatever you give away, whatever charities and whatever austerities you perform, everything, Krishna says, do it for me. And the consequence, Shubha Ashubha Falairevam Mokshase Karma Bandhane Sannyasa Yoga Yuktena Vimukto Mami Vaishyasi. And if you do this, you will become free of both good and bad karma. And becoming free of both good and bad karma, working in the spirit of mental renunciation or internal sannyas, you will come to me without fail. So Krishna has explained in this fourth chapter, before bringing the other forms of sacrifices which are described in the Vedas, Krishna has explained that The sacrifice that he emphasizes is the performance of your duties in a spirit of devotion and renunciation, without seeking any external fruit, but performing them in a form of devotional worship to the Supreme Lord. And in text 30, he points out, Sarvepi ati yagna vido yagna kshapita kalmashah yagna shishtam rito bhujo yanti brahma sanatanam. And all these people who perform this sacrifice, all these people who learn to perform this yagya, which turns off their default mode network, the cause of all suffering, receive the nectar of the remnants of such sacrifice. And what is the nectar of these remnants? The nectar of these remnants is the realization that you are not this Prakriti. In fact, Krishna points out that if you do not perform sacrifice, you cannot live happily in this world or the next. Because if you do not perform sacrifice, if you do not perform yajna, if you do not seize this default mode network, at least for some time every day, your suffering will increase. Your suffering will increase. But those who engage in performing sacrifice, which is shutting off this default mode network or the social cognition mode, which is this task negative network, those who remember God and forget the self, such people, they attain relief from suffering almost immediately. And not only do they attain relief from suffering almost immediately, but they, on leaving this body, return back to the Supreme Lord, becoming free from the cycle of birth and death. And no one, Krishna says, can live in this life and be happy if one does not perform yajna or sacrifice. And he goes on to say that all these sacrifices are approved by the Vedas, and they are born of different types of work. And knowing these sacrifices, performing these sacrifices, you will attain liberation and salvation, perfection in the supreme destination. There are two types of sacrifices, Krishna points out. There are sacrifices that are performed without knowledge and sacrifices that are performed with knowledge. Those that are performed without knowledge are performed mechanically. They're performed for various worldly reasons and purposes. And they're almost always performed with the desire to attain something within this world or the next. But those who are in knowledge, and having this knowledge, they perform this sacrifice. And they perform this sacrifice or yajna, not of material things, but with an idea to expand their knowledge and realization of God. Such people, Krishna explains, get realization of divinity. Now, how do you perform yagya? Where will you learn yagya? There are so many forms of yagya have been described in the Vedas. Krishna, of course, describes that form of yagya, which is the performance of your duties as sacrifice. And he also says that he is of all sacrifices, the chanting of the holy names. So, what Krishna wants from you is that most of your day, which is probably 8 hours of hard work, perhaps more for those who are so inclined, perform their work in a spirit of devotion and renunciation, remembering God and forgetting self, not thinking oneself to be the doer and not desiring any fruit. And when one is not thus gainfully employed, adding value to the world, when your mind would be otherwise idle, use that mind by engaging it in the task positive network by chanting the holy name of God. Now, how does one learn to perform sacrifice? You have to learn to perform sacrifice from someone who has performed sacrifice himself or herself. And through that performance of sacrifice has attained purity. Tadvidhi pranipatena pariprashnena sevaya upadekshanti te jnanam jnaninas tattva darshana. Just try to learn the truth. We're approaching a spiritual teacher. Offer service unto this person. Be humble and submissive unto him or her. Because this person who has attained purity and perfection through the performance of yajna can teach you how to perform sacrifice. And having learned this sacrifice, you will get spiritual realization. It's important to note here that the tradition of Guru has expanded itself from this original core message of Krishna. In this message of Krishna, which is in 4.34, Krishna is telling you to approach a spiritual teacher for what? To learn how to perform sacrifice. He doesn't tell him to surrender unto him, give up all your worldly goods unto him, become his slave, follow everything that he says. No. Krishna simply says, go unto him, be humble and submissive unto him, offer service unto him, because ask him and learn from him how to perform yajna. So the purpose of the spiritual teacher is to teach you yajna. And if he is truly realized through the performance of yajna, then by performing that yajna, what will you obtain? यज ज्ञात्वा न पुनर्मोहम एवं यस्यसि पांडव सर्वभूतानि अशेषाणि द्रक्ष्यस्य आत्मनो अथो मयि. When you have learnt the truth, you will know that all living beings are but part of me. They are in me and they are mine. So, with the performance of yajna, you will attain a dissolution of the sense of self. You will attain a transcendence of the sense of self. You may attain an extinction of the sense of self. And with this, you will spontaneously realize that all things are but part of divinity. They're in Him and they are His. This is the realization that you attain through the performance of yajna. And when you attain this, what is the result? What is the benefit of this realization or this knowledge? अपि चेदसि पापेभ्यो सर्वेभ्यो पापकृत्तमः सर्वं ज्ञानप्लवैनेव वृजनां सन्तरिष्यसि. Even if you are the most sinful amongst all sinners, even if you are a Nobel Prize winner of sinners, once you have this knowledge, seated on this boat of knowledge, that all things are lying within God, they're within Him and they're His, you will be able to cross over the entire ocean of misery, which is material existence. This dukhalayam ashashvatam, this anityam sukham lokam will be nothing, because on this boat of knowledge you will cross over it. Yatha idhamso samido yagnir bhasmasat kurute arjuna jnanagni dagda karmani bhasmasat kurute tatha. Just as the blazing fire turns firewood into ashes, so does the fire of knowledge burn to ashes all the reactions, all the consequences of all your material activities. So, all your karmic seeds, your sanchit karma, the sufferings that are brought to you by your prarabdha, all of them will become nothing, because just like fire burns firewood to ashes, so also all suffering will turn to nothing when you are seated on this boat of knowledge. And in this world, there is nothing so sublime and so pure as transcendental knowledge. This knowledge is the mature fruit of all yajnas, of all mysticism, of all meditation, of all yoga, and one who has attained this enjoys bliss within in due course of time. But this faith is required. For this, faith is required. Shraddhaval labate jnanam tatparat samyat indriyah jnanam labdva param shantim achirena adigacchati. The faithful person who is absorbed in this knowledge, who subdues his senses, quickly attains spiritual peace. Whereas those who have no faith, agnascha shraddhadanascha samshayatma vinashyati nayam lokosti na paro na sukham samshayatmana. But those who doubt the Vedas, those who doubt the words of God in the Bhagavad-Geeta, do not attain divine consciousness. Those who do not perform yajna, those who doubt this process, for them there is no happiness in this world, nor is there happiness in the next. Therefore, the Lord says, Yoga sanyashta karmanam jnana sanchinna samshayam atmavantam na karmani nibadnanti dhananjaya. one who follows this instruction which I am giving, which Krishna is giving in the Bhagavad-Gita, becomes free from all doubts. And becoming free from all doubts, he attains salvation. Therefore, Krishna says, Tasmad jnana sambhutam ritastam jnan asyanatmanah chitvainam samshayam yogam atishto krishi bharatah. Therefore, what doubts you have in your heart, slash them with the sword of knowledge. With this, we conclude the fourth chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. If you have any queries, questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Thank you, Shantanu for today's session. My first question to you is, you said that Yagna leads to the feeling of I'm nothing. When applied to everyday life, how can it help us to be successful?
How can it help you?
To be successful, to have to lead a more fulfilling life.
Yes, so when you perform, as Krishna says, when you perform everything as yajna, everything, yat karoshi, yad ashnasi, yat juhosi, dadasi, yat tapasyasi, kaunteya, tad kurusho madarpanam. Whatever you do, whatever you eat, whatever you offer, whatever you give away, whatever charities, whatever austerities you perform, you do them in a spirit of sacrifice to remember God and forget self. When you do this, you attain both spiritual and material success.
So yagya is in a way related to performing one's duties.
No, your duty has to be performed as yajna.
Mhm.
Your duty has to be performed in a spirit of yajna.
Hmm.
There are many people doing their duty in the world, and there are different rewards for them. But those who perform yajna as a sacrifice, those who perform their duties as a sacrifice, as a yajna, they are performing what Krishna is recommending. And thus, because they are performing their duties as a form of remembering God and forgetting self, they attain material success and spiritual perfection.
Another question for you, Shantanu is that you also mentioned that one should learn sacrifice from a guru. Um, that's what's written in the Bhagavad Gita. So, what are the characteristics of a true guru?
Well, such a discussion goes beyond simple questions and requires a separate lecture in itself
Mhm.
because there are many, shall I say, dangers on this path. Because you hear so many wrong things about gurus and you find so many stories of so-called gurus who have fallen into disastrous situations and thereby imperil the lives of their disciples as well. The real guru is in your heart. Ishvara sarvabhutanam hridaya deshe arjuna tistati brahmyan sarvabhutani yantrarudani maya. Krishna says, I am in your heart. He is the Chaitya Guru, he is the original Guru. And he is taking you onward towards your destiny. You are only seated in a machine made of material energy. And Krishna says, Tam eva sharanam gaccha sarva bhavena bharata tat prasadat param shantim sthanam prapshishi shashvatam. Simply surrender unto this Lord who is guiding you from within your heart, and you will attain peace, perfection, and the supreme destination. But here in this chapter, Krishna is explaining that to learn how to perform yajna, you need an external guru. For example, if you want to learn how to perform yajna or havan, You could probably approach somebody who is already performing yajna or havan and who has attained perfection through that process. If you want to learn from a person who has performed X or Y sacrifice, you must approach somebody who has already performed that sacrifice and has attained perfection, and you learn from him. So, an external teacher is required to teach you how to perform yajna. That is his role. Is that clear?
Yes. Thank you so much for today's enlightening session, Shantnuji. It was lovely to hear you. And for all our viewers, I would request you to, continue watching us and do join us next Thursday at 8 a.m. for yet another session on the Bhagavad Gita. Namaste.
Hari Om, Jai Shri Krishna, Hare Krishna.